Hey everybody, welcome to session 167 of the Behavioral Observations podcast. And I am still trying this YouTube thing. I don't have a teleprompter and I don't have this introduction memorized, so you might see me glancing over at my notes periodically, but we'll get through it together. I suppose I should say before going forward that the YouTube bylaws compel me to say things like, subscribe, and ring the bell for notifications. But what I'm really interested in is your comments. So feel free to leave your comments down below with regard to this episode. It is a doozy. It's awesome. So Dr. Jim Moore returns to the podcast, and we cover just so much territory. There's so much value in this episode. It's just awesome. So I'll try to hit some of the high points about that, about what we talk about, and then you can get into the interview right away. Before we do that, I do like to remind people that the podcast can serve your CEU needs. So if you're a behavior analyst and you need CEUs, we are an ACE provider. The royal we, I guess I'm using. It's just me. But yes, Positive Behavioral Outcomes, the parent company of Behavioral Observations, is a Type 2 or formerly Type 2 CE provider. They changed the name of it. And we've got lots of great deals. There's lots of discounts and things like that over on behavioralobservations.com/get-CEUs. And there'll be a link in the description down below, as they say on the YouTubes. So again, I'm still picking up this YouTube thing. Also, consider joining the Patreon if you want to support the show and get bonus content. With regard to this particular episode, this episode has been out in podcast and video form, completely unedited, and for patrons for several days now. So if you want early access to shows, go to patreon.com/behavioral observations and sign up for a tier that makes sense for your budget. And I suggest the early adopter package. You can actually pay for a whole year and save, I think, 1 or 2 months. It's a pretty good deal. So what do we talk about in this show? So Jim and I spent the first couple of minutes just kind of catching up on how things have gone. It's been a couple of years since I've had him on the show. Jim and I have managed to keep in touch, however, and so we chat periodically about all sorts of things. And I think this particular interview is a culmination of some of our discussions that we've had while we're both kind of on the road or between appointments or what have you. And boy, do I always learn something from Jim when I chat with him. What did we talk about today? We talked about, kind of our differing views, or at least initially differing views on what it means to engage in scientific behavior. And that also includes who is and who isn't a scientist. How identifying research questions is different depending on whether or not you're in clinical practice or you're in a research setting. He gave us one really cool anecdote about solving a behavior problem that was rooted in perhaps some overly rigid rule adherence. He walked us through how they worked that problem out. It was really fascinating and very, very unconventional as it relates to behavioral orthodoxy, I suppose. And we talked about his kind of go-to things, his checklist, if you will, in terms of troubleshooting stalled learner progress. There's two other really, really cool sections. I would, if you don't listen to anything else in this particular interview, I'd really love for you to focus just on these. And one is we talk about the importance of conducting a really solid caregiver interview and what are some keys for doing that. Something we don't really have a lot of research on, certainly, but it's certainly something we really should start paying attention to, what makes for a good interview in terms of the information we get when we are trying to learn about the nature of an individual's challenging behaviors. The second part that I really want you to pay attention to and hope you get a lot out of is his approach to supervision. I'm not going to recap it here because I'm not going to speak for him because he does a much better job, sharing his ideas than I am. But it's really one of my favorite parts of this conversation. It's so incredibly good. So I think for those reasons and more, I would love for you to check out the episode in its entirety. Jim also spends a few minutes talking about the presentation he's going to give at this year's Stone Soup Conference, which is coming up in late October. If you go to behavioralobservations.com and go to the show notes for this page, we'll have links to direct you to that if you want to go check out that conference. It's a smoking deal, and we've got podcast-related discounts, all sorts of good stuff like that. And then we talk about Jim's point of view on the varying functional analysis practices that are out there in our field right now, and how he thinks about selecting a functional analysis methodology depending on the learner profile. Again, I think that's, I keep coming back to this word nuanced when I think about how Jim conceptualizes these things. It's a really sophisticated point of view that he's developed over the years, and I'm just delighted to share it with you. If you are a Patreon member, or if you are a Patreon member, we do spend about 20 or so minutes of bonus content where we talk about football, we talk about the Saints and Patriots. After we recorded, the Saints actually beat up on the Patriots pretty badly. I'm sure some people are heartbroken about that in listener and viewer land. We talk about what it's like to be a Saints fan in the Atlanta metro area, but we also talk about the parallels between good coaching and football and good clinical practice and good supervision. So it's not just, two dudes talking about their favorite football teams. There's some interesting parallels as well. Jim was also too gracious to do so, but I will shamelessly plug his new employer, the Apollo Group. So if you like the type of behavior analysis that Jim is practicing, and you're in that neck of the woods in the Atlanta metro area, and they might be expanding beyond that too, I would reach out to Jim, and because I know their group is interested in growing their practice just like most practices are. He's pretty easy to find on social media. I'll put a link to his LinkedIn profile in the show notes over at behavioralobservations.com. One last thing I'll say. So a bit of a confession of sorts. The audio and video quality for this particular interview is not the usual behavioral observation standard, unfortunately. Jim had, as you'll see very quickly, Jim had to record this interview in his car because he gave up his office and the conference room, the two other places that he was going to record this show at, because of client needs at the clinic. So good on him for placing clients over a silly podcast or YouTube interview. I don't think that once the interview gets going, you'll notice, and it actually jumps right out at you at the outset. But Jim's content here is so good, you'll forget about it right away. So I think that's going to do it for opening remarks. Without any further delay, please enjoy this really wide-ranging and fascinating conversation with Dr. Jim Moore. And again, go to behavioralobservations.com, session 167, for links and show notes, et cetera, et cetera. All right, let's get into it. Dr. Jim Moore, welcome back to the Behavioral Observations Podcast. It's great to talk with you again.
Hey, Matt, it's great to be back. It's been quite a while.
It has. And what perhaps the audience doesn't know is that you and I have continued to chat between our original podcast interview and, through present day, I suppose. And we always have these fun conversations. And like some of our other colleagues that we were just talking about before we hit the record button, I always learn something from you when we talk. And so I want to share some of this stuff with the audience because it's, you have a lot of really interesting and insightful things and just a really neat perspective on the field. And again, I think it's important to share that with the practitioners who are out there in the audience.
Absolutely.
So, because folks already know you, and if they don't, I'll link the earlier interview in the notes for today's episode. For those that are in that category, they can go back and check that out. And, so we did the whole how'd you get into ABA thing already. So let's just kind of jump into catching us up a little bit. I know you've moved, you got a new gig, you got a lot of changes in your life. So why don't you just take a minute to kind of catch us up on what's new with Jim Moore?
Yes, I've moved to Atlanta, Georgia. I'm the Chief Clinical Officer for Apollo Behavior Services. We're currently a single clinic, but we're expanding. We'll probably have 4 clinics by the end of this year. And we're really trying to merge this idea of privately funded ABA, but with the highest clinical quality possible. I don't work for a private equity firm. It's more of a family trust, a family circle, I believe is what it's called, where a number of families have come together looking to invest. So they are looking for a return on their investment, but more importantly, they're looking to make an impact in the world. And our CEO, Kim Dean, started talking to me about 2 years ago, had kind of educated himself on ABA, had talked a lot with Sarah Troutman, and really saw an opportunity to improve the delivery of ABA services. Um, and really is dedicated to the highest level of clinical quality, which includes infusing RFT and stimulus equivalents into autism treatment. He had come down to Jackson, Mississippi, and spent some time with me with my previous employer, and was really amazed at the outcomes that he was seeing with his own eyes with our kids. And so he really came and talked to me. And of course, I was skeptical, like I think many of us are in the field. Kind of for profit is kind of a 4-letter word, even though it has more letters in it than that, because we've seen a lot of questionable things coming from that private equity arm of ABA. But the more I talked with him, he was very persistent. The more I talked with him, the more I saw that, the mom and pop, clinics that have limited cash flow, limited resources, they have great outcomes, but it's hard for them to expand their impact because of a lot of the financial hurdles that are very difficult to overcome in practice. And so after a lot of consideration and a lot of talk, I talked with his board members. They had already hired some clinicians at the end of 2020. I talked to a lot of them. I visited, and I really saw it as an opportunity to see, can we, make this, for-profit approach to ABA with outstanding clinical outcomes work? Because I've come to believe that it's really vital for the success of our field. We say that these things are evil, but I think all people would agree. More resources mean better outcomes for our clients. Better pay means better lifestyles for our professionals and our paraprofessionals. And so I made the move here in June, actually the end of May, and we're kind of taking a very dedicated, very slow approach to growing our practice. When we started here, we had 4 BCBAs. We're up to, I believe, 10 now, and we're hiring in advance of opening clinics so that those folks can almost do like a mini fellowship with me and really learn how we're infusing stimulus equivalents and RFT into the more traditional approaches that we've always used in applied behavior analysis. I think that RFT especially gets a knock because they think it means you're throwing out everything else that we've ever done, and that's just simply not true. Some operands are much more appropriate with some of our more traditional methods, but when we try to think about building repertoires that help our clients with autism have the most independent lives they can, to have the most autonomy in their decision making and the highest level of dignity, I believe that an approach that includes RFT is really the direction our field should be headed. So I moved here in May. I have a new son, Axel Blaze. He is now about to be 11 months old, and I'm told he is the spitting image of me, though he's much more handsome than I am. But it's a lot of fun. People who know me, I'll be 50 next year, and so folks are like, have you lost your mind? You have a 28-year-old daughter. I have a 21-year-old daughter and a 12-year-old daughter, and now I have an 11-month-old son. And so also have had 2 wonderful stepchildren come into my lives, Atlas and Kaya. They are 2 and 3. So our house is a plethora of small children. And it's really exciting because now, I've had children kind of throughout my career, and each of them and the way I raised them kind of reflected where I was in my career. And to now see small children again and their developmental trajectory and how they learn with what I know now in my career. It's extraordinarily exciting. We're able to have actual talking much earlier. I've learned over the years the importance of orienting behaviors and motivation. So his orienting it just blows me away. And so that's a big change. And of course, for those who may have viewed or heard my first talk, the pandemic has hit my health pretty hard, coupled with, living in a home with someone who was pregnant. I've put on quite a bit of weight.
I see.
If you remember, I discussed in the first talk that, kind of this act-based approach to weight management. You don't ever become immune to aversive stimuli. You build your tolerance toward it. And the pandemic, coupled with a pretty rough move, having a new baby and some other things going on in my personal life, I was way beyond my threshold of aversive stimulation. So now, I try to jokingly tell people, hey, I just needed another replication
There you
of my
go.
weight loss.
It's a replication crisis, right?
Way to get. I'd actually given a talk at FABA before the pandemic, and I'd put pictures of myself up throughout my life, and I had a good ABA. Now I just need another B,
There you go.
and here we go. We'll have some experimental control.
So we can maybe dig into that a little bit more towards the conclusion of our chat here, because I have some follow-up questions on that. At the same time, one of the things that I know you were very interested in talking about with me, and by extension the audience, is the topic of being scientist practitioners, if you will, or having a more science first approach, I suppose. I'll let you title it however you like or characterize it however you like, but as a way of kind of teeing up the topic here, one of the things that I always thought, you and I have had these conversations on the phone before, but I don't consider myself a scientist, and I'm totally at peace with that. I'm not. In other words, I kind of think of myself as a much like a dentist would, or a family physician or something along those lines, where my feet are firmly in practice. I'm not doing any. I'm not conducting any research for, to advance the science, if you will. My goals are about the treatment of the presenting challenges in a way that helps the clients, as you were alluding to earlier, live more independently, meet their goals, live in line with their values, etc. And so, I've often thought of, I have these rants in my mind, almost like headlines that I'll never, to articles I'll never write, and I've always wanted to write something that says like, hey, you're not a scientist, get over it, and that's fine, or something like that. So when you broached this particular topic, I was really intrigued, because I get intrigued by things that that run contrary to my point of view. So having said all that, Jim, so talk to me a little bit about how your point of view developed as it relates to, doing applied research in your practice and things like that. And obviously, I want to give you the opportunity to elaborate more in terms of why you thought this topic was important to share with the audience.
Sure. So, first of all, I think a large goal of my appearance today is to maybe convince you that you are a scientist.
Okay.
Personally, I don't know how a behavior analyst practices what I was taught as behavior analysis without engaging in scientific behavior. And that's been instilled in me since I was a graduate student. I was mentored in graduate school by a school psychologist who was also well trained in behavior analysis, the late Ron Edwards. And he had written an article in 1987 called Implementing the Scientist Practitioner Model, the School Psychologist as Database Problem Solver. And I can provide that article. I can probably drop it in the chat box here in a second. So from the very start, I was told and taught that using the tools of science was the best way to solve my clients' issues. That was followed up by my pre-doctoral internship that I conducted with Wayne Fisher and Kathleen Piazza. And Wayne, at the time and still to this day, um, often says that, if we conduct our cases in a manner in which we may want to disseminate those results, either through publication or presentation, the most important thing that happens is better outcomes for the client. But as I've kind of gone through, and I've always had a problem with folks who said, I'm not a scientist, I'm just a practitioner, I don't do research. And in my younger days, I found myself getting in some heated debates with folks, which would extend into how should behavior analysts be trained, so on and so forth. And really, over the last 6 years, part of my career has been in a regulatory function. I was the chair of the Mississippi Behavior Analysis Licensure Board for 4 years. And for the last 2 years, I've been on the BACB board. And so I've kind of gotten an up close and personal view of kind of maybe some of the not so nice things that are happening in practice. And what I see, and then also a part of that is I kind of took, a couple of years before the pandemic, I started going on kind of what my wife calls me the Gordon Ramsay kitchen nightmares of ABA, because I would consult with clinics that were not really producing outcomes. They had often toxic cultures. Folks were stressed out, burned out. And when I went into these clinics, the overarching thing I saw is they were not engaging in analysis, meaning they were not using the tools of science to solve their clients' problems. They were going in, they were looking at the topography of the behavior. If they were doing what they thought was an analysis, it was pretty much pulling something off the pages of Java and implementing it exactly as they read it, without any consideration of individual client variables. And that's whether it was an Awadian, more traditional functional analysis, for example, or the ISCA from Greg Henley. In their language assessments, they were just kind of mindlessly implementing what they were taught in graduate school. And what I just really saw was, and I was for years using this term, applied research. And it kind of morphed into what I use now, client-oriented research. But even with that, I'm starting to wonder if the word research is the thing people can't get past. And so if you look at the word research, I think most people connect with the dictionary definition that's a noun: the systematic investigation into and study of materials and sources in order to establish facts and reach new conclusions. But research is also a verb, which simply is defined as investigate systematically. Now, would we want a behavior analyst in practice to systematically investigate client problems, or kind of half-heartedly just kind of look at things and maybe just throw some interventions based on their experience, or some, cookbook of interventions they have on their bookshelf? I think we would all agree that we would want that individual to investigate their client's problems systematically. And so I don't know, we get so locked into our terminology in the field. Do I conduct what I consider to be research like you see in Java? No, even though I have published applied research in Java, I don't consider that research like most people would consider it. And what I mean by research, it's the work, the very, very good work that's coming out of our academic halls, our research facilities. And it's almost a priori, meaning they have a research question, like I want to look at behavioral resurgence, or I want to look at the use of signal DRO schedules versus unsignaled DRO schedules, or whatever the question may be. The question has developed before the participant is in the room. And then the process with this approach to research is to go out and find clients or participants that meet your parameters that may be suitable for that research question. What I'm talking about in client-oriented research is it's an approach to evidence-based practice. And so I want to pause there for a second, because I think Wayne Fuqua has really brilliantly delineated what does evidence-based practice mean? It's the intersection of your client and family preferences or values, clinical data and experience, and then the best available research. It doesn't mean that, hey, I have a kid engaging in motor stereotypy. Let me go pull out a study from Java on motor stereotypy and use it with my client. No, what it means in evidence-based practice is that I use the best clinical data I can gather. I can use my experience with that client, with other clients with similar behaviors and functional properties to connect myself to research that may be relevant for that client. But even then, I should go on and say, what more could benefit this client and benefit practice? So in this approach, the clinical needs of the client sets the research agenda. So their referral concerns are our research questions. So we get the participant before we develop the research question. And then two, it establishes the potential to expand and improve clinical practice globally. You know, I've given lots of trainings, been to lots of clinics. I've listened to lots of questions and answers from practitioners, like if I go to a conference. The questions are always practical in nature. Like, how do I do this in clinical practice? And the problem is that a lot of the studies that are in our literature are that a priori, because so they don't necessarily always meet the clinical needs of the child or adult that's right in front of us. And so it's difficult. You know, you'll hear folks say, well, maybe we need more translational research. Even then, I'm still taking an a priori approach and maybe trying to translate some basic research into some applied relevance. That's really not what I'm talking about either. I'm talking about literally approaching every problem the client presents, developing testable questions from those referral concerns, and then using the tools of science to solve those. To me, I don't know any other way to function as a behavior analyst if I don't do that. You know, so for example, Skinner in not behavioral organisms of science and human behavior kind of delineated these seven. He called them attitudes. I think that was funny that he used the word attitudes. I call them kind of values of science, or the
I'm sorry.
behavior.
What could you say? What do you call them?
I call them values of
Okay.
science. You know, it's kind of like, because values tell me committed actions I should take, behaviors I should engage in under each one of those. And the two that I see most lacking in practice, and I even see this in academia too, are philosophical doubt, which is healthy skepticism. And in clinical practice, you know, I challenge my team every day. Can we do better than this? You know, I don't use an ISCA because I think Greg Hanley's smart. I use it if I think it's clinically appropriate. But even then, can we do better? Can we do better for this client? Can we do better for the next client? If I'm doing the same ISCA every single time, I don't think that's what Greg intends, but that's what I see a lot of the times in clinical practice. So this healthy skepticism, which has really benefited me my entire career. If you'd have told me coming out of Kennedy Krieger and Marcus that I would one day be asked to give talks on relational frame theory, I would have said, you lost your mind. I don't even know what that is. But because I constantly found myself saying, can't I do better for this client? You know, isn't there something better? Can't we make our methodologies better? Do we really think we know everything there is to know about human behavior? I certainly don't think so. And so it drives us towards excellence in everything we do. And then the next is parsimony. You know, I teach my behavior analysts when they go in and conduct what we call ProMod sessions. It's an insurance code 97155. Many of your listeners will know
Oh
exactly what
yeah. Even a school critter like myself knows what 97155 is. So
so the whole premise is you're going in assuming that things are not going as you expect for your client. Well, I shouldn't go in assuming that I'm just going to throw the whole protocol out the window and start over. But that's what I see happen a lot of the times. And they start just trying to throw interventions at the problem instead of taking a parsimonious scientific approach, which starts with rule outs. That's what the medical field does. They have to rule out more more simplistic. If you go in and you look like, um, maybe you have schizophrenia, well, they're going to test you for cocaine consumption first, before they just go ahead and say, oh, this person's schizophrenic. And it's the same thing. And, ultimately, when you carve everything down in most everything we do in ABA in practice, it comes down to two things. Is the learner orienting towards the relevant stimuli in the learning trial or attending? I don't use the word eye contact because I've seen that look like, hey, look at me.
Yeah.
That's just weird. Can they flexibly and fluidly shift their orienting to whatever the relevant stimuli are in that learning trial? And as we all know, most of our learners with autism really struggle with that. And then two, is the learner motivated? It's like I hear this running joke. It's like, how many more articles does Java have to post to show that reinforcement works? Well, apparently several more, because I find the motivational side of assessing new learners one of the things that we really struggle with as a field. I'll go in and they'll say, well, we think he likes kinetic sand. Well, okay, well, he worked for it. And so, you know, before I go in and assume, I'm going to rule out, is the learner attending? Are they orienting to the relevant stimuli? Are they discriminating the contingencies? And two, are they motivated? Next,
Well,
I
yeah,
need to look.
hang on. They might like the sand, but if you put a contingency in place, they're
That's
not gonna.
exactly.
Yeah, I see that a lot of times, and it's obviously the distinction between a reward and a reinforcer. Or, it's a nice to have, but not something that is something that someone's gonna emit any urges of energy to obtain.
Yeah, most people know I love the New Orleans Saints, probably a little too much to a little unhealthy extreme. But I now live in Atlanta, so when the Saints play opposite the Falcons, I'm not going to get that game on local television. I love the Saints. I'm not willing to pay $100 to get the NFL season ticket so I can see the Saints game. I'll just listen to it on the radio. I'm not,
Sure.
when we start placing those demands, on those potential reinforcers, oftentimes we find that they're not as reinforcing as we may have thought. But then a lot of behavior analysts in practice, because I believe they've not been taught a scientific problem solving method, never question that. Like, well, he likes that. Again, it's not about like. It's about how much will they do for that? How much will it promote learning and truly reinforce behavior? And so once we have ruled out, okay, maybe my learner is attending, maybe my learner is motivated. Okay, well, let me first now look at the quality of my data. Am I using an appropriate measurement tool? That hardly gets asked in many of the clinics I visit. And unfortunately, and I want to apologize to any listeners who are champions of partial interval recording. When you really look at the data, it's like there's, I mean, you can almost just get an abacus and put on blinders and get better data than collecting data with partial interval recording. I understand that it's easy, but when you really look at it, I have a graphic that of real data where I've taken duration data, taken the same observations, compared it to whole interval, partial interval, momentary time sampling. And partial interval recording is such a gross overestimate often of behavior.
Yeah,
And so,
I know you and I have talked about the standard acceleration chart and dimensional units of, and I think the bigger issue here is, counting dimensional units of behavior is perhaps the better standard. And
yeah, instead of all these
Rick,
derivative discontinuous measures,
yeah, Rick Cabina has an awesome slide that he uses in workshops where he does the same thing that you do in terms of showing, showing data collected on a partial interval, and using partial interval strategies, and then collecting data using counts, if you will, and it's really striking. And he actually goes through it different exercises where people actually are collecting data, and then compares them and things like that. I think that the only reason I'm kind of interjecting here and interrupting your story is to just further emphasize that point, I suppose, because I totally agree.
right? But see that shows, Matt, that your thinking is scientific, because again, that's philosophical doubt.
Yeah, well,
right?
so one of the things I would say, Jim, is that maybe it's just a quibble over language, I suppose, and what we're calling things. So, and
Quite
that
often
became
it's
kind of apparent at the outset of your overview of this topic. So, yeah, so maybe I am a scientist after all. I don't know. It remains to be. We'll maybe come to some conclusion at the end of this conversation. We'll see.
awesome. So I find that a lot of times behavior analysts are not putting very much thought into the most appropriate measurement tool for a variety of reasons.
Yeah,
And
that's
that's the
what we do here, right? That's the worst one.
it's just that's no. That's not behavior analysis. I don't know what that is, but it's not behavior analysis as I was trained. But let's assume, so let's rule that out. It's like, do we have an appropriate measurement tool or methodology? Okay, let's say we do. Now, are those data being collected, with any sort of accuracy, reliability, agreement, however you want to talk about it? We can get into the whole, peeling the onion down about how do you measure IOA, but I need some minimal measure. And, what we do in our 97155 sessions is the very first thing that's done is the BCBA collects data simultaneously with the behavior tech and assesses IOA. Because, a lot of our practicing BCBAs, they see just a sliver of the client's behavior compared to the techs that work with them every day. And so if I'm going to make, so I'm having to make decisions based on graphs, and I have to question the reliability and accuracy of those graphs before I start changing protocols. So that's another rule out. Okay, let's say I have good IOA. Do I have good treatment integrity? Is the intervention plan that I wrote, hopefully based on very good assessment data, being implemented as intended? Now, here I've gotten some pushback because they're like, well, you can't just go in and say it's treatment integrity. Well, I've talked with Gina Green and our folks at APPA that are pushing out a lot of great content on code usage and the modification of the implementation of existing treatment protocol is a modification and it's an appropriate activity for 97155. If you think about the code elements, I have to show an interaction with the client, an interaction with the therapist. If I am now modeling how the treatment should be implemented, allowing the tech to rehearse while giving them feedback, I've met all the elements of that code. And parsimony dictates that it is better for me to correct an existing protocol that's not being implemented with good integrity than writing what's the if they're not implementing this protocol, do I expect them to implement the next protocol with any better integrity? So it's a scientific approach to problem solving where I'm really trying. And you know what, Matt, I've found is in probably, if I had to guess, over 95% of the clinical cases that I've either directly worked on or supervised, it's always something simple. Our behaviors, the topographies can look very complex. And as you try to untangle the contingencies, they can look very, very complex. But when you really start hammering down, in philosophy, a version of parsimony is called Occam's razor. If I kind of slash through those problems with an eye on simplicity, my favorite Einstein quote is out of complexity, find simplicity. And that's another implementation of scientific behavior into the database problem solving of my clients' issues. And so what I found is by taking that approach, and I've seen almost miraculous turnarounds. It's almost like you see the practitioner's face light up because they're thinking in their mind, oh, research. I'm not Wayne Fisher. I'm not Greg Hanley. Who am I? I'm not Steve Hayes. When my daughter won the second grade science fair in her whole school, she was a scientist in that project. She used the scientific method. She had good control over what she did, and she was just looking at the effects of color on a water receptacle on heating up water to extract energy from a peanut. And so if a second grader can be a scientist, surely a professional with at least a master's degree, working in a field based on science. And then a couple of other things. I hate reading stuff because it's boring. But as I've gone through this journey, I've gone through and I've found some really relevant quotes. I want to read them real quick. The Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory defines applied research as something designed to solve practical problems of the modern world rather than to acquire knowledge for knowledge's sake. One might say that the goal of the applied scientist is to improve the human condition. Bear, Wolf, and Risley, we all know the 7 dimensions, right? What most people might not remember is this quote: the differences between applied and basic research are not differences between that which discovers and that which merely applies. Both endeavors ask what controls the behavior under study. And then they go on and they talk about, and there's another quote in there that's a little bit longer, I won't read it, but really kind of hammering this idea that, hey, what we're supposed to be about is the analysis of sources of functional control over human behavior, whether we're doing that in a university setting or we're doing it in a practical setting. But, we talk a lot about gaps from research to practice. And I believe that the problem is unless I'm in a facility that matches a lot of the a priori questions that research facilities are asking, I'm kind of lost. For example, we were shocked a couple of years ago. We published a client-oriented research piece comparing different error correction strategies on kids who are engaging in what Wayne calls pseudo-guessing. One kid had some scrolling behavior. And so when we looked into the literature, we were shocked to see how few studies there are on prompting and error correction. There are so many studies now on resurgence of problem behavior, which is great work, really interesting work. But most of the practitioners I talk to don't deal with that on a daily basis, but they engage in prompting and error correction behaviors every single day.
Yeah.
And the question is, what will improve clinical practice the best? Research that's coming out of academic institutions or research that's coming from the ground, the grassroots? In preparations, I noticed in one of your questions you talked about doctors. But doctors, practicing doctors do influence research. For example, when I was at Marcus, we had many kids on the drug Seroquel for its antipsychotic effects, and that's what its original FDA approval was on. But we started noticing more and more kids were being prescribed Seroquel at bedtime as a sleep aid, because when you watch kids take that, it will knock them on their butt. But it didn't currently have that FDA approval at that time. But what happened was, as more practicing physicians prescribed Seroquel for sleep, it stimulated research to extend FDA approval to Seroquel as a sleep aid.
Oh yeah.
So,
SSRIs was the same story, 25, 30 years ago. It was, originally, Prozac, Paxil, etc., came out as antidepressants, and then it seemed to also be helpful for anxiety and the related disorders underneath that particular umbrella.
That's exactly right. I've encountered lots of people who are on the drug Lexapro, and they don't even realize it's an SSRI because it's been prescribed to them for sleeping problems. And so when I was like, "Oh, you're on SSRI," they're like, "What?" Like, go and look it up.
Really? I didn't know it was even prescribed. So it's approved. Is it approved for that, or is that an off-label use? Just out of curiosity.
I don't know. I don't know that. I haven't looked into that, but I've
Okay.
seen folks prescribe. Dear friend of mine years ago was prescribed Lexapro just at bedtime to help with sleeping problems.
Yeah.
My mother, who's kind of getting up there in years, she's on Lexapro now, just at bedtime for sleep. But yeah,
maybe she could share some with mine. But that's a different podcast. But anyway, moving on.
So when you really think about, hey, practitioners often, when they ask these questions at workshops or on podcasts, it's almost as if they feel like they're on an island all by themselves. Even if they're in a big practice, they'll often feel like, hey, I'm in this little silo all by myself. I don't know what to do. I need help. And, I've encountered so many practitioners who said, well, yeah, I tried this study from Java, and it really kind of blew up in my face, and they were very discouraged. And it's like, really, if you take that model of evidence-based practice that we discussed earlier, use those values of science, or what I call the tools of science, to really systematically problem solve for your clients, you don't ever have to publish any of that. The hardest part of this client oriented research approach that I take is the writing of the manuscripts, because that often has to happen after hours. I'm a full time practitioner, so I don't have time carved out in my schedule for writing. So all of that, all the writing that I do is usually after my family has gone to sleep. So I've gotten better about emailing colleagues for articles at 2 in the morning. I used to people say, like, well, you're emailing me at all hours of the night. Do you ever sleep? So, if you don't value publishing, I would say, hey, if you're doing great science based practice, at least consider presenting at your local conferences.
Yep.
Share that work for other behavioralists who may not have encountered this approach, because I've seen just these dramatic transformations in even their quality of life, their outlook on the field, their outlook on their profession and on their current job, because they now feel equipped to solve any problem. We did this just yesterday rounds with all my BCBAs, and so we were in a session. Um, I was coaching the BCBA through rule outs, and one of those rule outs is also often barriers. Like, if you're primarily trying to target skill acquisition, well, what barriers are there to the acquisition of these skills? And so the BCBA was very focused on orienting, which is great. But what she was missing was the fact that the client was engaging in pretty significant levels of motor stereotypy. And I said, well, what do you think is going on with all this motor stereotypy we're seeing? And it was very inconsistent. We would see the kid at 10, show all the signs of a motivated learner 1 second, and then boom, he's off into his world of motor stereotypy the next second. And I said, do you know the functional properties of that behavior? She said, no. I was like, well, let's probe it out. She said, what? I said, we're about to quickly alternate some ignore time versus some competing stimuli time. We're going to see if there's anything there. And we started to see, and this is not trying to run some structured publication I've seen in Java. It's literally, here's what's going on. This is what we're going to do. We're going to probe it out. And if we see something there, we'll let this probing inform a methodology that we'll implement later today. And so we spent about 30 minutes probing out the behavior in the morning. I gave the team some directives. They wrote up protocols, got data collection sheets ready, and then 2 o'clock that afternoon, we ran a competing stimuli analysis in a multi-element with ignore conditions to demonstrate that, hey, here's the baseline level of automatically reinforced motor stereotypy, and here's how various different stimuli that we're claiming to use as reinforcers compete with that stereotypy. And so now that's going to inform treatment that hopefully will mean more time the learner is engaged with the learning activities. And that all
was that the I think you posted some of those things, obviously information redacted, but I saw you post something. Was that the case that you were referring to? I think you posted it on Facebook or LinkedIn or something like that.
Yesterday, and it's just really to show folks that it's like, with all due respect to our friends in technology and the technology platforms that help us with data collection, sometimes it's difficult for practitioners to do things like a multi-element functional analysis and plug it into these programs. And so what will end up happening is they'll collect all of these data. They'll just be sitting there. They think that they're intimate with the data because they keep looking at their data sheets. I'm like, no, set up a computer right here outside the room. It took me 30 seconds to build an Excel template to graph those data for us as we were going. Back in the day, we used to handwrite our data, carry them up to Wayne, let him look at them every single session. We want to be that intimate with our clients' data. And so that allowed us to make decisions on the fly, on the spot, as we're going through the analysis. The behavioralists that are, I've always found too, when we start engaging in this work that looks real sciencey, a crowd starts to gather. So we started off with just a couple of us working. We had the client's therapist, we had the supervising BCBA, and then myself. Then we had another BCBA we've recently hired. She doesn't have a caseload yet. Next thing we know, she's in wanting to collect data. Then another tech who was on administrative time was like, "Hey, I want to collect data. I want to maybe run some of these sessions." And the whole, so by the end of the day, we had about 6 people congregating around. Sometimes in clinical practice, your kid calls out sick. Well, rather than have them clean the toys or clean the windows, those things have to happen. Why not get them engaged in some science happening right there in the clinic so they can learn from that and benefit from that? And I'm finding that the more the techs interact with science-based problem solving, the more they start to think that way themselves. So instead of saying, well, my client looks frustrated, then they start to really tact more of the functional properties of the behavior, because now they're starting to learn to observe both the client, but also the client's interaction with their contextual environment. So it's I really, it's really kind of making me think, the more I talk through it with folks, and we're writing up a paper on this approach, um, it's really making me think that maybe we have to figure out another word other than research, because that's kind of like, oh my gosh,
Right.
you talk to practitioners and they hated their research eval class. They maybe even had to take a stats class that made them think that, oh, I don't know stats, so I shouldn't do research. It's really all unfortunate, because I think that using those tools of science, those values of science, has really never failed me. When I've had difficulties or struggles with clients, it's because I've deviated from those tools of science and those steps I just outlined.
A minute ago, you were kind of forming a list, if you will, of rule outs. And I want to ask a follow-up question. So if I understood you correctly, you said, first we need to look at, are we collecting the right kind of data?
Mm-hmm.
Are those data reliable? And then treatment integrity is, perhaps the next on the list. And when you go back, so it sounds like, the first order of business, if you're encountering, problems with client progress, is to, we might call that kind of getting back to the basics and whatnot. And it sounds like you've seen that orienting the therapists and the junior BCBAs towards those elements is largely successful. So if I've characterized your sentiments correctly, I'm going to continue with another question here. So
Sure.
do you find that people want the problems to be more complicated? Like, I can imagine being in the tech role or the BCBA role, and if you came in and say, well, Matt, well, are you collecting the right data? And I'd be like, come on, man, like, so, like, 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 it's really something, more complicated than that, because that seems obvious. I'm just curious what the reactions are, or is it like, oh, thank goodness it's so simple, or does it vary based on, because people are different and whatnot. So
I think
just from a from
definitely.
a from a supervisory standpoint, I want to hear how that works, or what your experiences are as a mentor, as a leader, as a supervisor.
Well, I think that there's there's lots of talk in our field about supervision. There's basically, in my opinion, 2 ways that you can approach giving feedback to whoever you're supervising. You can tell them what they're doing right or what they may be doing wrong, or you can lead them through kind of what I call Socratic questioning to arrive at the answer themselves. And I've always found, I was listening to a supervisor give feedback just the other day, and it was like this litany of things. And as the supervisee would say, but what about this? There was always a counter, and it's almost like this tit for tat. And I see that as a supervisor. I think a lot of professors train under that feedback model. It's like, oh, your question. Let me tell you how you're wrong.
Mm-hmm.
And I very rarely see that approach change behavior. This kind of, well, you didn't think about that. And, I try to take into these contexts. Like, I supervise BCBAs that have been certified for less than a year. And I've been doing this for 25 years. I would hope that I have seen more things, and my experience would make me a little bit more efficient at problem solving. So I have to recognize that kind of almost power imbalance. And if I go in firing in questions or pointing out things that are wrong, or even taking the session over and showing them how it needs to be, I rarely find that approach effective. But when I start to question, when I'll say, hey, tell me what you see right now. Does this learner look engaged to you? And then they put their own problem solving skills to use. That they'll almost always say, well, no, I don't think that they're engaged. Okay, so you've written a really great DRO protocol here, but your learner is not attending to those contingencies. So they're not engaged, they're not orienting to the stimuli that you're using associated with this really good BIP. So what do you think needs to happen? And almost 100% of the time, no matter what level of experience they are, the BCBA will say, we have to get them attending. We have to increase their orienting. We have to address their motivation. So they kind of arrive at that conclusion themselves. I kind of try to tee it up for them just through a series of open-ended kind of Socratic type questions. And it's almost like once you lead the person to the conclusion themselves, and they've used their own intelligence and their own experience and their own education to figure that out once you've put it right in front of them, then most of the time, in my experience, they don't even think about levels of complexity. They're like, oh my gosh, because I'll hear this all the time. It's like basics. It's like I'll go into a clinic and, one of the strategies that I often use is kind of a version of Bob Stram's 7 steps of instructional control. And because if you really think about that, our learners come in from very inconsistently implemented contingencies. We need to get them at some baseline level on just good behavior management. And, I've found that for about, 80 to 85% of our clients, consistent, good implementation of those 7 steps eliminates most of the problem behaviors we'd see from those clients. And I'll get told, well, when we get past the basics, parsimony demands that if the basics drastically improve the quality of my life, I need evidence that I need to increase the complexity to make their lives even better, right? And so I really rarely get pushback on that, and I've really attributed it to the way that you approach that supervisory relationship. I've had plenty of supervisors who basically give me the litany. I've seen tons of techs get feedback like that. And really, kind of if you remember Charlie Brown and the teacher's voice, like,
Oh, yes.
don't hear that. But when we're getting that feedback, what we tend to hear is, you suck, you suck, you suck, you suck. Why do you suck? Get better. And that can really devastate someone's motivation, their desire to try and really, consistently implement their passion for behavior analysis in their clients with excellence. Who likes that? Who likes to hear that? And so really what I've found is just by kind of using my questions, and then sometimes I do have to get involved. And then I always ask for permission. Hey, do you mind if I take the session over for a little while? And then I'll show them, hey, if I take just a little bit of time to really try and establish my attention as a reinforcer, to really try to motivate the client to orient to the stimuli I need them to, and they see that happen. It happened yesterday with this client. I immediately got him engaged. And you can, the differences between a motivated learner and an unmotivated learner are not difficult to see. But what I've found is that it's the approach. Typically, if it's met with that kind of reaction, I've almost always found that there's probably some other variables at play here. That person may be playing a little bit of imposter syndrome. They aren't comfortable, not always feeling that they're right, which is kind of a whole other litany of issues that need to be addressed in supervision. It's been really wonderful to see as I've gone across the country how excited BCBAs get when they actually see it, when they actually see, oh wow, this is science. Like literally before I posted that Facebook post, I was like, hey everyone, great job in being scientists today. And they were like, wait, that was science? Yes, it's science. We just use science to get an out. Now, they had tried functional analyses with this client before, pulled straight out of the papers of Java that produced 0.
I see.
And what the difference was is to let that literature inform what we do, but to let my clinical data and my clinical experience, because I need to connect the client to a methodology that's appropriate for the individual properties of their behavior. And so I see that usually, usually if I get any kind of negative feedback, it's usually, why didn't I learn this in graduate school? Well, have a
Yeah.
whole podcast about
That's
training.
that's a whole other show. That is an excellent segue, though, Jim. I do want to talk about your views on functional assessment, because you and I have had many, many conversations about this as we're both driving around hither and yon in the car. Before we get to that, though, I do want to give you the opportunity to tease your talk that you're doing at the Stone Soup Conference. The Stone Soup Conference is coming up in October. I think it's the 24th. Don't quote me on that. I'll have all the details in the show notes for today's episode. And they have certainly generously sponsored this podcast. So big shout out to all my friends over there who are putting on the Stone Soup Conference. The lineup looks fantastic.
Really does.
It's a who's who of behavioral observations guests. I think the only one I haven't had on is Jordan, and I'll have to fix that soon. And I've certainly admired his work for sure.
Jordan is a brilliant behavior analyst.
I was going to say the extent to which I understand it. So maybe I can get him on and maybe simplify things, break it down for my pea brain. But anyway, so we'll have links to that. And and one last thing, I suppose, it's extraordinarily affordable. They went out of their way to make this incredibly accessible to folks. They even gave the listeners a discount code. Again, go to the show notes for this episode. You'll find all that information there. Okay, now that little bit of promotion notwithstanding, tell me what a little bit of, don't give it all away, because we want people to sign up and attend the conference, but what are you going to be talking about?
So really, it's one of the more interesting talks that I probably will have ever given, because it's really a accumulation of data that are difficult for me to explain right now, which is reductions in some pretty significant challenging behavior through specifically targeting equivalence and RFT learning and skill acquisition programs. And again, I don't want to ruffle any of my friends in academia's feathers, because they're going to think I'm about to blaspheme Skinner or something. But I've been dealing with various levels of severe problem behavior most of my career. I've implemented, I think, just about every approach to functional analysis that's currently out there, and some things of my own based on client needs. And when I started working with more verbally sophisticated clients, I noticed that a lot of those methods are very ineffective. I started noticing that the problem behaviors that we would see, especially with our more verbally sophisticated learners with autism, didn't always show the same topographical characteristics of some of our other clients. Their responses to extinction didn't quite look the same. And I really started, let me just pause for a second to say, I think one of the least understood concepts that a lot of practicing behavior analysts, really don't know about, because they weren't trained on it, is rule-governed behavior. Mm-hmm. And, our learners, as they start to develop those repertoires, which means that they're self-generating rules. Let me give you an example. For whatever reason, Sally has to go down the bread aisle at the grocery store before the meat aisle, even though it's more convenient for mom to go down the meat aisle. Now, some people might call that control as a behavioral function. She's developed a rule. I mean, it's a very rigid rule. But what starts to happen is parents, as parents often do, try to accommodate their children as much as possible to avoid meltdowns. Well, then they go to school, they go into community settings, they go somewhere else where those rules aren't always directly reinforced. And then what you see looks more like extinction to me. You see this just overly emotional meltdown where the child is almost inconsolable. And we're trying all of these traditional methods. We're trying to three-step them to comply. We're trying because we can't allow escape. When really what's going on is that their self-generated rule, again, there's not a whole lot of research on this. It's very difficult data because we have behaviors going on within the organism that are hard to measure. But what seems to be happening is rule governed behavior. They've generated this very rigid rule. They don't have very strong repertoires with arbitrary stimuli, which is vital if you're going to now engage in rule governed behavior. Mom has kind of intermittently reinforced those behaviors over time.
Mm-hmm.
Get into settings where it's not, and it looks like what they're encountering, rather than just a clear behavioral function, is extinction. And so, what we found, just quite by accident, is a lot of our kids with some behaviors like elopement, aggression, some of these other behaviors, while we're waiting on approval for codes to do an FA, we're doing the best we can just to take them through some stimulus equivalence and RFT learning. And what we start to see is as we build flexibility with their language, then we start to see more behavioral flexibility. Now we see by the time we get the codes approved to do an FA on elopement, there's no more elopement. Once we get the codes approved to do aggression, the kid's not aggressive anymore. I literally went into one session, and a lot of these are data. There is something in the world of science called qualitative experimental data. It's where you try to set up experimental conditions, but you're not generating numbers, you're generating narratives. And so I've used that throughout my career to develop methodologies to get quantitative experimental data. I'm not quite there yet, but what I'm presenting on is, like, we have this one kid, his elopement eliminates. I go into the session and literally say to him, "Hey, dude, what happened with all the running away?" And I said, "Well, first of all, it's like, what was up with all that running away you were doing?" He goes, "Well, Mom said stranger danger." And when we knew this learner, when he was less verbally sophisticated, anything Mama said, you might as well carve it in granite. He was going to take that on as a rule that could never be violated. So I went back into his data and found that, wow, on every day we had instances of elopement, he was either with a new therapist or there was a new therapist in his area. So and my hypothesis is, he was literally following that rule with so rigidly that no other contextual variables were at play. I said, well, what happened? What happened to when you're not running away now? He said, well, I figured out that Mom wouldn't put me in an unsafe place. And I know other people here. I figured it out. Well, I would hypothesize that when you look at his data, especially his data in the Peak T curriculum, we've now developed a repertoire where he can handle more arbitrary stimuli, more arbitrary concepts, where now, instead of conforming to these rigid rules, other contextual variables allow for behavioral flexibility. And so I have a number of these sets. I have a number of kind of social narratives where I'd ask kids, before we would put them through stimulus equivalence and RFT, like, tell me a story about a mouse and a cat who are friends. And you want to talk about some kids just losing their minds. It's like they would never be friends. The cat's going to eat the mouse. They're enemies. To where now, with a little bit more behavioral flexibility, they can discriminate that in the context of my story, it's a rule that they need to make a story about them being friends. And so you would see, like, within 6-month periods where this kid would literally throw down if you tried to get him to tell you a story about a cat and a mouse who were friends. 6 months later, now he's like, that would be a weird story, but here's how it goes. The mouse and the cat live together. The cat gets a job to buy the mouse cheese because no one wants to hire a dirty rat. That's literally a story I've been told by a 6-year-old with autism. And as you try to explain, how does that repertoire develop? How do we go from point A in January, the kid's about to fight you because you're trying to make him tell a story that seems so absurd to him, to 6 months later in June, he's now not only willing to do it, but he actually tells a pretty good story. And so I'm presenting, as I talked with the Stone Soup folks about the variety of data that I could present, it was actually those data they were most interested in. And so I'm excited. I'm a little nervous because I'm going to have to give the big disclaimer. It's like, hey, I haven't even figured out a way to measure this yet. I mean, we're starting to try and find correlations between relational repertoires and problem behavior. Jordan does have a a correlational study showing as peak E scores rise, QABF ratings decrease, which is a suggestion. I mean, I'm not so rigid as a scientist that I just, completely reject correlational data, because sometimes that's a hint towards where you need to go. So that's kind of what I'm talking about at Stone Soup. I'm really excited, a little bit nervous, but
Oh man, it sounds way cool. It reminds me, the rigidity. It reminds me of I think there was a Steve Hay study in JAB in the '80s where there was I'll have to dig it out and put it in the show notes. But it was very, very clearly showed the inflexibility to not match changing contingencies.
that's right. I actually used that. That's actually a 1987 study,
Okay, thank you.
and what it is, it's multiple schedules, and I vary it a little bit. I actually have to give credit to Mark Dixon. Mark talks about that study. I actually put people through it when I do training, so we'll give them a task, and what we find is that if the learner is alone, their behavior does conform to the matching law most of the time. But even just putting them in a room with other people that may be on different schedules, their behavior varies so far from the contingencies. Now you give them a rule, and despite clear evidence that they're not meeting the direct acting contingencies that are in front of them, they will stick to that rule to the point of anger. I've had BCBAs stand up in meetings saying, "What in the heck are you trying to pull off? You're just trying to make us mad." Like, no, I'm trying to demonstrate to you that because of our rule governed repertoire, the matching law is not always a law for humans. And that study from Steve is really, it's one of my favorites.
Yep.
It's just a really brilliant, cool study.
So I talked about your views on functional assessment earlier. I don't know if you still have time to chat about that, but we talked about it a little bit. But I know as you were saying a few minutes ago, you've tried every functional analytic technique under the sun, and again, just alluding to some of our conversations that I've had over the last couple of years. Your point of view is not dogmatic. It's fairly nuanced, and I would like you, if you have a few more minutes to hang on with us here, to share that point of view, or at least talk us through your thinking on how to approach functional assessment of challenging behavior, given the variety of approaches that are out there, the internecine battles, et cetera, et cetera. So
Yeah, I tried to figure out it. It's somewhere close to 10,000, I think, different functional assessment conditions or analysis conditions I've either directly implemented or directly supervised. I tried to figure it out over my 25-year career. But early on in my career, again, because of the later on Edwards, I was really encouraged to use this database problem solving approach to see what's the most appropriate assessment methodology for my clients. And I love how Greg talks about the balance of efficiency and effectiveness. And so when we can, if we can find indirect measures that do have pretty good predictive validity, we should let those inform the analysis conditions that we design. I really, the only use at this point in my career that I find in single operant, contingency analysis is when I really have no idea what's going on with the behavior. And this is a point where Greg and I kind of in the hallway of ABAI a few years ago disagreed. We had just given a symposium together, and I have this kind of flow chart that I use in decision making. And it all stems off the open-ended interview. Now, no doubt Greg is probably a vastly superior interviewer than I am, but I'm pretty good. But even I have had interviews where you just get nothing from the caregiver or the teacher, just literally nothing. And I have large concerns about throwing multiple contingencies at a behavior that I don't fully understand through indirect measures. When I'm very confident, I have no problem doing that, because I do agree that sometimes it's, for example, escape, the way we conceptualize it from an Awadian analysis, assumes on the front end that the task is an MO for escape. That's not always true. And I feel like if practitioners or researchers spent more time with typically developing kids, they would definitely see that to be true. Or even our EBD kids who are very verbally sophisticated and have some real gnarly behaviors. Because sometimes the task is an SD for the availability of something else. And Mike Mueller and Heather Sterling and I published a study on this. I believe it was in 1999 in School Psychology Review. We couldn't get a behavior analytic journal to take it because what we did is we compared a traditional escape contingency to something we called escape to attention. And if in the presence of a task, the availability of attention is more probable, children will learn to engage in problem behavior to access that task. That led me to do an even deeper analysis that I did publish in JABA, looking at demand contexts in classrooms, uh, because I don't believe we fully understand all the functional properties of demand settings. And so, but to kind of, I digress, long before Greg or I were talking about open-ended interviews, a colleague of mine named Tony Doggett had published a study comparing interview outcomes, rating scale outcomes, and functional analysis outcomes, and found that when when the parents or the teachers seem to have pretty good predictive validity in their ratings of problem behaviors, that the functional analysis outcomes really confirm those interview outcomes. Well, we published that study, but he did a more important study with his dissertation where he simply did open-ended interviews and went straight to treatment. And across the board, those treatments were successful. He never published those data. I really wish he did because I think those data were really strong. But when I'm doing an open-ended interview, I'm really trying to assess the accuracy of the information I'm getting. And so we talk about open-ended interviews, but what I'm talking about is I want the parent to tell me a story about their child's behavior. Because if they're just answering a litany of questions, like what parent will say, if I go, when your child engages in aggression, do you give them attention? Most parents are going to say no. Or do you allow them to escape your demands? No. I simply want to say, okay, when's the last time your child was really aggressive? Well, we were at Golden Corral and we were trying to get out to the car. Well, what happened? They start telling me what happened. I said, then what happened? What did you do? What did happen? If I'm just kind of like having a conversation with them, what I find is, I would hypothesize, is they start with their private behavior. Those MOs start to become very functional again in the moment. You can see their respiration increases. You can see that they're really starting to become agitated. They start shaking their hands. They start, it's like, oh my gosh, and everybody was looking at us. And I was just trying to get Jaden into the seat, and he was screaming his head off. Well, if I am a good database detective, I can start picking out what's going on functionally there. And I can quickly then devise a test condition if I feel like I need it to verify that that's what's going on functionally. Now, that doesn't always mean I'm going to put 3 contingencies in. It might be 2. I might arrange the contingencies slightly different than what we've even seen in the literature. It's going to be, but if I have a parent who's like, yeah, he was bad at Golden Corral. Well, what did he do? That's what we're here for, man. He's aggressive. What's going on? You get that a lot from some parents. They just don't want to open up about it. Then what do you do? Well, this is where Greg got upset with me. It's like, I do find value in putting them through a single contingency analysis. Because even if I get nothing, if I'm very observant, I understand the contingencies that are in place now, and I can see how the behavior or other behaviors that may be related to the referral behavior may vary under that analysis. And it very may well often lead to more understanding about the true kind of synthesized, or I really call them combinatorial contingencies that are relevant to the child's behavior. So it really starts with that interview and how confident am I in those interview outcomes. Now, Rick Smith was our discussant on that. I think it was 2018 ABAI. And he looked right at Greg and me and said, "Hey, obviously you guys are great at interviewing. How do you train all behavioralists to be that great?" And I think that's a really, most, I talk to a lot of behavior analysts and they're like, "Hey, where was clinical interviewing covered in your training program?" Well, it wasn't. Did you get an opportunity to do clinical interviews in your practicum? No.
Yeah. Has anyone supervised you doing that? Right.
Yeah, it's like, oh my gosh, I feel very fortunate. I think Linda LeBlanc talked about this on the last Inside Java episode on your podcast. Is that because we have PhDs in psychology, we had to take whole courses on clinical interviewing, and that skill set. So the first thing I'd say to a practicing BCBA is, hey, when you have an opportunity, and it might not always be from the field of behavior analysis, if you see a CE opportunity about clinical interviewing, take advantage of that. Learn how to really be a database detective with your interviews. The more you come directly at a parent, and if you put them on the defensive at all, you're not going to get any relevant information. And so there is, right, I think right now we talk a lot about open-ended interviews, and unfortunately, there's a lot more art to it than there currently is science around it. I know I've heard some folks, I think on your podcast and others, that are started talking about motivational interviewing,
Yep.
which is really coming to us from counseling psychology and addiction. But I think there's some promise there, but we still need, I mean, if I'm going to use my approach to functional assessment, which I appreciate, I love the term nuanced, I like that, or really Greg's approach, or really anything, I really need to be good at interviewing. Because I need to in my private verbal behavior be able to reconstruct what that likely looks like in the natural setting. So
Yeah,
yeah,
so if I were to kind of maybe extract a few, I guess, tactics, if you will, is to get stakeholders to tell stories as opposed to answer, question, answer, question, answer, question, and then also attend to not just what they're saying, but the nonverbal characteristics of how they're saying it. And when you see the emotion, kind of as the undercurrent of their stories, you're onto something because they're talking about a situation that was extremely salient to them for one reason or another, and that's where the relevant environmental stimuli can be found.
that's absolutely right. Absolutely
Awesome.
right. And so then, yeah, there's many times where I am so confident in what the so confident interview. Why do you do analysis? I don't. I mean, I don't. If I have extraordinarily high confidence, you know, I might go in and probe it out, but I think the faster we can get kids into treatment, a functional based, I still think that's a function based treatment because my undergirding hypothesis is assuming functionality based on the interview outcomes. I kind of think that's a next step. Tony did his dissertation back in 1997 or 98. So these things have been around for a long time. Greg told me once that he really got onto the ISCA idea reading our escape to attention paper in a school psych journal. If he had not been diligent to look outside of behavior analysis, maybe he would have never come across that because Greg, much like me at that point in his career, was seeing that, wow, here are some kids where this approach is just not effective, sometimes even very dangerous. But so it's really, we're supposed to be individualized. And here's kind of my cherry on top of this whole Sunday of functional assessment is I shouldn't be in a camp. I shouldn't be an Awadian functional analysis guy. I shouldn't be a Greg Haley ISCA functional analysis guy because I'm supposed to be doing individualized approaches. And whatever my data suggests is the most appropriate assessment procedure for the client, that's the one I should use. And I feel like right now we kind of have these two camps that are very dogmatic. And I have to really attend to my Facebook behavior so I don't come across snarky. Because I'm like, listen, is this science or is this a fan club? Either side of it, and it's like, so I'll ask somebody whether they use only Awadian approaches or only ISCA approaches. When's the last time you asked yourself, is this the right thing for my client?
Mm.
Is this the best thing for my client? When's the last time you asked that? And if the proponents of any functional assessment approach take issue with that question, I have a lot of concerns because that's more dogma than it is science, in my opinion.
Okay. All right. Very cool. I've kept you up, I think, at least 20 or 30 minutes over the time I had asked for. I know we're going to do some bonus content here for
Sure.
patrons. Do you have a few minutes more to chat?
I do. I'd love to hear what questions are out there.
All right. All right. Very
I'll
good.
do my best to answer them.
Yeah, they're so I want to so we talked about the fitness situation early on. We can get more into that in just a second. But let's just, as a palate cleanser, if you will, how are the Saints looking this year?